we're lucky to have, okay, I'm sorry. Please start broadcasting to YouTube. Thank you. Oh, you are already. You didn't wait for me. We're lucky to have with us Leslie Olberholzer, Principal Codometrics, who will be presenting to us about form-based codes. She's one of the leading experts in the country, and she's on this subject and has developed the form-based code for Hartford, locally amongst many others, and is familiar to some of the folks on this committee as well. So I welcome you, Leslie. Just kind of talk about the agenda. The predominant aspect of today's meeting will be the presentation by Leslie, and then the follow-on questions that we have and discussion we can have following Leslie's presentation. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the subgroups and subgroup leadership that we've talked about establishing at our last meeting. And that's the nature of today's meeting. The next meeting will be following the July 4th holiday, and we can talk a little bit about that. So, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie and make some introductions and proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I have not only written the code for Hartford, but also just completed the code for Bridgeport, which has a really cool way to view the code. And it's a code tied to the map. And so you can go online and look at the map and click your parcel, and it takes you directly into the code. So it's a pretty fun way to view the code. But I have been doing this now for about 15 years, writing form-based codes. I decided to really focus on form-based codes because for me, it brings together sort of the aspect of urban design with kind of the metrics of regulations. And I love the kind of intersection of those two things. I'm not gonna, if you have questions for me about past codes that I've written, I'm happy to talk further, but I serve on the steering committee for the Form-Based Codes Institute, which is now a part of Smart Growth America. And we really enjoy kind of forwarding the use of form-based codes across the country. So I'm here today, and I'm going to talk to you kind of broadly about form-based codes and model, or what I like to call template codes. I know you all have had some presentations, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with a form-based code. I just kind of want to go at it from the perspective that I typically use when I'm diving into a community and talking to them about form-based codes. The definition of form-based codes on the FBCI website, I've sort of parsed it out into these 4 items, and I'm going to kind of talk you through each one of these items. First of all is that physical form is the organizing structure, whereas use has been used in the past. Form-based codes are meant to focus on the public realm. The way that we have defined form-based codes at FBCI is that sort of walkable community, focusing the buildings on the public realm, having street walls and so on. Most importantly, though, they are meant to be objective regulations, not design guidelines. They use the terms, shall and must, as opposed to shoulds and coulds. And that is meant to produce a more predictable form, but also a more predictable approval process. I'm sure you've probably seen this diagram in other ways. Sometimes it uses boxes, but the idea behind it is to get across to people that form-based codes are all about more predictable form. They are meant to be used to establish clear form. So they are best used in places that you have a clear sense of what that form is meant to be. Whereas conventional codes have always used use as the structure. So you have R1, B1, C1, I1 for industrial, or M1 for manufacturing, really organized based on use. And with a form-based code, when we dive into a community, we like to sort of break that community up into the different forms that either exist or are desired. A lot of times when I'm trying to explain this to a community, I'll show them in their existing zoning how much of their code, their actual zoning code, is about form. And it's usually like 4 lines. It's the building setback or the building height, sometimes FAR, but very little of it. When you're looking at 3 pages of a zoning district, it's this little tiny block about building form, and then it's this ongoing list of uses. And so we try to kind of flip that with the form-based code. The other part is, as I was saying, when we dive into a community, we're really looking at all of the different kind of context zones or place types within a community. Context from the more rural aspects of a community to the more urban, or if we're looking at a more rural community or a more urban community, sort of trying to figure out what all of that sort of broad level context is in the community, but also at the kind of micro level in a community. You may have more urban places within a community, or more suburban places, or more rural places. And so those zones need to kind of match that context as we're developing throughout. I know that you all have heard about the SMART code. I know you've had a presentation on it, so I'm not going to get into a lot of details, but except to sort of give you my opinions about it. The SMART code is a fabulous tool for defining context. And this idea of the rural to urban transect through a community is, I think, really the basis of most planning that's done today. Understanding where you are within that framework, but also understanding that that framework is meant to be used at the broad level within a community as well as at the smaller level in a community. So you can have different sort of T zones within a neighborhood, or you can have different T zones within the whole community. The downtown to the more suburban areas of a city or a town. Or you can, sort of look at it statewide and say, you've got your more urban areas and your more rural areas. So it's meant to be this sort of relational context that you can use depending on, how far you've dove into the place. Again, you're looking at it from a sort of citywide perspective, the small city on the left-hand side of the page. You might consider that red area the T5 or the T6 of that community, all the way out to, the outer edges, which would be the rural T zones. Whereas in this neighborhood that you see on the right-hand side, you could consider that sort of neighborhood center of the purple as that neighborhood's T5 or T4, all the way to, the more suburban residential in that kind of light yellow color. So again, sort of illustrating how that context can be applied to a community. The other interesting aspect of this slide is that the circle that you see on the left-hand side on that more conventionally zoned community, that circle encompasses the same amount of area as what you see on the right-hand side for the form-based code. And that's because we like to look at the community at a more human scale. So we're sort of looking at all the complexities of that neighborhood and defining it. So you can have, 5 or 6 zones within that circle in a form-based code, whereas usually conventional zoning uses a sort of broad swaths of colors within the neighborhood or zones within the neighborhood. So again, looking at that physical form, but looking at it from a kind of more human scale, and understanding that, when you're walking through a community, you're experiencing, in that 1/4 mile walk, you're experiencing a lot of different contexts. So as I said, the form-based code is meant to focus on the public realm. And this community, I love using these slides. It's an excellent example of just sort of the extremes of applying a form-based code to a community. This is a really small community. It's a college town where a small neighborhood that you can kind of start to see in this image on the left was zoned multifamily in the 1950s in order to accommodate more student housing for that university. And this is the type of multifamily that they're getting on the left-hand side. It's just, vanilla, blank walls on the street, just meant to kind of house those students, right? Without any appreciation for the context of that neighborhood. And so we were asked to develop a form-based code specifically for that small neighborhood. And we took our cues from the existing housing and applied, just some very simple regulations that said, you must have windows on the street. You must have an entrance that has some kind of a transition, like a porch or stoop from the street. You must have a building cap that, matches kind of the scale and the slopes of the houses in the neighborhood. And then the buildings that were developed from that form-based code are what you see on the right. Obviously, some people do it better than others. Some people take it further than others. But the idea here was that we're creating a series of regulations that meant that we are trying to create better places. These buildings are meant to be nicer buildings. They're meant to fit into the neighborhood. And so those cues were taken, in the top image to the nth degree. We didn't say you have to have porches across the whole front. And in the bottom, it's a much better building, maybe not perfect, beautiful architecture, but just a much better, more friendly building along the street. So again, focusing on that public realm and defining the walkability within the community. And from a commercial perspective, this series of images, you can find a lot of these on the FBCI website that are excellent to use. Steve Price with Urban Advantage does these kind of photo montages where he takes an existing place. This is a street scene actually in Chicago where, I think the zoning code said a 0 setback from the sidewalk. And instead of just doing, a building at the sidewalk, which is, I think, what the intent was, they pushed the building all the way back. They used that minimum front yard setback, which said you could either build it at the back of the sidewalk or across your parking lot. And Steve Price adds buildings and shows you what that space could be. And I think what the intent probably was for that area. We've since rewritten, and this area now has a sort of mini light form-based code that says, the building must build a street wall up at the street, but you can see the difference. It's the same place. The cars don't change for how you can illustrate what a form-based code is meant to do for the public realm. And so, as I said, objective regulations are a big part of form-based code, also illustrating and providing and presenting those regulations in a way that more people can understand them and get to the point more quickly. Conventional zoning tends to, really highly conventional zoning. I don't think anybody does this as much anymore, but there are a lot that are still on the books. Just a lot of text, not organized very well, not presented very well. The idea behind a form-based set of regulations is to present very clearly, what the end goal is. I tend to use a series of pages per building type so that you can look at, a smaller portion of the code, pretty easily. What you need to be following. We like to use images to convey intent. We like to use really simple diagrams. I don't tend to use sort of 3D diagrams because I think sometimes they can design the building a bit too far. But simple diagrams that are keyed to the regulation so you can get a sense of where the building is meant to go. In terms of more predictable regulations, within that, again, I've just talked about the setback line versus a build to zone or a build to line that leads to much more predictable buildings and public realms. Floor area ratio is still used in lots of codes. It's still even applied in lots of codes. I have a real problem with it unless you're talking about, really intense downtowns, and floor area ratio can come in handy in those instances. But you can see the level of predictability that you get with a floor area ratio of 1.0, as you can see on that left-hand slide. Either of those building forms would meet that regulation, which is, really unfortunate. Whereas in a form-based code, we sort of have that decision-making process during the public design process to determine, what are the heights that we want to see? How much street wall do we want to have along that street? And so creating more predictable, more objective regulations that are much more predictable is the goal. These are a couple of images, a few images from a code that I developed for Boulder, Colorado. There was a very specific area that was meant to be kind of a TOD. I think the train isn't coming there, so it's kind of a bus transfer facility at this point. Hopefully it will get train at some point in the future. The building that you see on the left-hand side was what they were getting. They have a extremely robust process for approval of buildings in Boulder. They have a series of shoulds, a set of guidelines for an approval process that goes, to the planning board and then to the council for approval. It is really hard to meet. Buildings end up having to be redesigned several times through the process. They have a lot of staff, and they have a great staff who really care about the buildings, and they tend to kind of work within the framework of these shoulds and the guidelines. But again, what they were getting from a quality of building design wasn't great. They were sort of missing some cues that were pretty clear, like how materials change at, different planes of the building, what those materials are, how the buildings are capped, how those windows sort of fit into the facade. They were doing really well with that public realm, building the building up to the street and determining where they were going to have the storefronts, but just the quality of the buildings wasn't so great. And so we wrote a form-based code that was meant to apply, much more objective regulations that they then are now able to approve by right. So no more jumping through the hoops of the planning board. You follow the regulations, and if you follow the regulations and staff reviews it, just checking those lines off that you've met it, then you can get, approved without going through those public processes. For this particular area, that works really well. We just finished another code for them that's much more part of a neighborhood. And so we'll see how that goes. But the buildings that you can see on the right-hand side are much higher quality. The windows are recessed. The building materials work together much better. They're higher quality building materials, simpler building materials, instead of this sort of, mishmash of buildings. So we really were able to write a code that addressed the issues that they were concerned with building design. To be more predictable. And I think, predictable building form and building design is really important with the form-based code, but that approval process is probably the most important aspect. Most communities use a PUD or a PDD process to approve buildings, especially more intensive buildings. And the problem with that is it's replacing what is mapped. So a community member goes to the map and sees a PD on the map, has no idea what the regulations are. They would have to go to City Hall and dig up the regulations to understand what those buildings could be in the future, which is, not predictable at all. While PDs or PUDs were meant to provide for flexibility and a kind of focus on open space, that's obviously not always what we're looking for with walkable, more urban communities. That negotiated process can be very expensive, both for the community as well as for the developer. And so, that ultimately can lack a lot of predictability, but also just make it really expensive and time consuming. So a form-based code is mapped very specifically, as I've just said. The community has a better sense of what those building forms will be. They can, go to the map and then look at the code and know what those buildings are going to develop as, which is a higher level of predictability. It can save money and time on the developer's end by creating, hopefully, an administrative approval process. And, those costs that are saved can result in, higher quality building materials. So that's sort of the exchange, because we typically require those in the code to say, well, yes, we're requiring, more brick, but you don't have to jump through these hoops and, waste all this time in the approval process. I will say that we do tend to build in some level of flexibility into the process through relief mechanisms. And essentially what we try to do is say, well, if you want relief from this regulation, then you do need to jump through some of those hoops, and it's going to cost you time and probably money. So that's sort of the exchange that we tend to use with those relief mechanisms. So just a few common misconceptions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think you all already know most of these, but form-based codes do absolutely address use. I still get clients today that say, but I thought we weren't going to talk about use. And it's like, no, you absolutely will need to talk about use. And sometimes use is a big part of writing a form-based code. We really want those restaurants and retail businesses in storefronts, as opposed to just letting them occur anywhere. We want to create those, concentrated districts of activity. There is often an assumption that there is no public feedback with that by right approval process. And what we like to say is that, this is why the process of writing the code really needs to include the public. You need to have public workshops. The public needs to understand what's going into that code. The idea is that you're sort of building in that public review in the actual code, but also being more transparent with that code and making sure that it's available for people to use and that it's easier to use and easier to understand. There is a misconception that form-based codes have to be more complex. And I will say there is a sort of, a longer list of form regulations in a form-based code. But again, once you go through that project review process, if you take those tables and you sort of check them off as you're going down, you find that it's a much simpler process than saying, oh, you should be designing high quality buildings. Well, what does that mean? That to me is more complexity because it's not, everybody's not on the same page. When you have a list of 20 clear objective regulations, that means that it's, it's more complexity because it's more regulations, but they're simpler to administer and simpler to understand. And then I also hear that, well, we're just designing the buildings for you. It's going to just be too monotonous. And what I try to do when I write a form-based code is really focus on sort of key elements that you really want. The intent behind the code is to have high quality buildings that are going to withstand the test of time. And that means high quality materials, that you want to focus on that walkability in the public realm, as well as human scale, making sure that the buildings are, built in stories that are articulated, mimicking kind of how a person would use a building. And I show you, I don't think Frank Gehry's, I don't know what you call it, dancing house in Prague was built with a form-based code, but it most certainly could meet a form-based code that could be written for that area of Prague. It does have those that articulation of stories. It has glass on the street. The ground floor is treated in a certain way. It really fits well into the urban context. I can't say that about all of his buildings. And most of his buildings would sort of be that unique, within the urban fabric, this is, our jewel. But this particular building, I think, does a great job of kind of fitting within the urban fabric, and then, having some craziness to it. So buildings don't have to be monotonous. So that's kind of what is a form-based code, and some common misconceptions. But more importantly, I think it's important to note that form-based coding is a process. That a process of diving into a community and understanding what's on the ground, and then understanding what the community wants, is really important. And so I've just sort of written out these 5 steps that I tend to go through when I start a form-based code process. The first step is obviously to review and analyze previous visioning and planning. Form-based code is a tool to implement a community's vision. Sometimes establishing that vision is part of the process. You're doing a master plan and a form-based code. But I think it's really important to not restart everything. We need to go back and understand, what the plan of conservation and development says, or what the comprehensive plan says, and build off of that. Usually I'm not doing a master plan. Usually I'm the implementation tool for a planning process that's just recently been completed. But reviewing and understanding all of that past work is really important. Identifying the different context areas within a community or within a state are really important. Surveying what's on the ground, surveying what's been done in the local and regional areas is important. Examining recent trends and documenting missing typologies. I'm going to go through 2 through 5 because you know what to look at in a plan. But identifying the context areas first at kind of that macro level. And I've gone back to the SMART code. As I said before, I think it's an excellent tool for understanding context. It's sort of set the framework for a lot of planning that we're doing today. Every planner should know the SMART code framework. It's also interesting to note that the SMART code does have this other level or series of level. It creates these sectors of where your growth should occur. And some people call this kind of the degree of change, defining the areas where you want a lot of change to occur versus areas that you want to be maintaining. That's really important at the kind of higher level of defining your context areas. Where are you going to see a lot going on? But then also, where are your more urban locations? Where are your more suburban locations within your community? So that sort of macro level of understanding. And then I think, as I said before, it's important to sort of dive into that micro level or the neighborhood level. And these are a couple of pages out of what I now kind of call the directions memo for a community. This is from Hartford, where we took that neighborhood, we defined a little bit about that neighborhood, but then we began to identify all of those little areas within the neighborhood, where the commercial corridors, where the commercial nodes, where the different intensities of housing occurring, where's that mix of housing occurring. We created, then we defined the series of building types and noted those. And we did this for every neighborhood within the community. I did the same thing in Bridgeport. Meaning that as the zoning writer, I have looked at pretty much every building in every community, diving in and really understanding and building the code kind of from the ground up. This definition of those kind of context areas within each neighborhood means that you have a level of variety and a level of interest that meets the human need within the community. It means that you're creating complete neighborhoods. You're identifying how far that person has to walk to get their daily needs. Hopefully someday in the future, we can have little neighborhood commercial zones that people can walk to, to the pub or to pick up your groceries for the day or your milk for the day at least. And then also incorporating that mix of housing types and understanding, that there can be a mix of housing types through a neighborhood. It doesn't have to be a kind of all one homogenous thing. So understanding those different context areas, as part of that process. When we start to work in a community, we like to survey that existing form. This is using GIS, which is a great tool for looking at existing form in a community. It's still missing a lot of what I hope will eventually be incorporated into GIS in the future. Building era is a great tool. I think, understanding when all of the buildings in a neighborhood were built and kind of mapping it and color coding it at this scale, you can't really see, this is Bridgeport, you can't really see those colors, but when you blow it up and you look at it, it really kind of helps you to understand, what building forms you're going to find where, just based on the era of the buildings. And then looking at lot size is really important. And I know that that's a big concern in Connecticut. Again, this is Bridgeport, and you can see how the older areas of Bridgeport had these really fine-grained, very tiny lots. And then as the place grew, the lots got bigger and bigger. And you can kind of see on the edges those sort of estate lots. I will say that I think it's much more important to be mapping lot width. And in Bridgeport, we were lucky enough to be able to have that information. Most places do not have that. And again, looking at lots from a public realm perspective, how narrow each one of those lots is along a street can define how that neighborhood feels and how far you have to walk to get out of that neighborhood. The depth of the parcels is not quite as important in terms of that, but ultimately how many units of housing you can get certainly is important. But I also like lot width as an element to map, and I think that can be really, really helpful. Now, what I have been doing in communities, I'm working in Allentown, Pennsylvania, is to actually map the building types. And so I've created a kind of key and go through and in GIS actually dropping in what all those building types are. It's a really intensive, expensive process, but I think ultimately can be really helpful for the community moving forward if they're using their form-based code and revising it. Also, in terms of surveying existing form, identifying that mix of housing types within a community. This is a series of housing types from, kind of the apartment building, the more urban apartment building. And I try to look at new construction as much as possible because, looking at the old construction, while it's great to identify context areas, is not great for writing new code from, because sometimes you can't repeat those older forms. So finding new construction examples, these are apartments. They could be, row houses or townhouses, cottage courts, accessory dwelling units, the sort of big house or the manor, multifamily, multiple units in a kind of a smaller apartment building or a bigger house, and then small lots, single family. So going into the community and identifying where those mix of housing, where those housing types are occurring, and then working together to figure out how you can mix those within a neighborhood or a context area. Examining recent trends in construction. This was a community where we just went in and found all of the new construction that had occurred. Habitat was doing a bunch of small lot, single family houses, but they wanted low pitched roofs in neighborhoods that had higher pitched roofs. And people were complaining that those houses, didn't fit into the neighborhood. It's great to provide low income housing or inexpensive housing in a neighborhood, but just that roof pitch can make all the difference in the world in terms of, making it fit within the neighborhood and making people happy that those houses are going into their neighborhood. creating, new developments that have just too big a yard for what the community needed, blank walls on the ground floor, just really identifying what are the recent trends and what are the issues that they're experiencing. And then also documenting desired building types. And of course, missing middle is a part of that. And I'm sure you all have heard about missing middle housing. We've just always called it a mix of housing types. But it's great to have some terminology to use that everybody gets, looking at, from kind of the apartments, all of the variety that exists in our country in terms of types of housing and how you can see some of those will fit into, neighborhoods. Also, I think it's really important to keep in mind that, small lot, single family can mix really well into a neighborhood and is really important to have, as well as accessory dwelling units. And we've had just great success recently with getting accessory dwelling units allowed kind of across the board in single family neighborhoods in a really wide variety of communities. So, that's a lot of information about, what a form-based code is and some of the process that we've gone through. I just want to take a minute to look at templates or model codes. And of course, that means that we really need to kind of understand some of the types of form-based codes that are out there. In terms of structure, I think many form-based codes use building types. It's the easiest structure for the average person in a community to understand, in my opinion. When you say a storefront building or a house building, people understand what you're getting at. Frontage types is a little harder for people to understand, but once you explain it, they can get it. And those can be mapped, by the street face. That's sort of the ultimate in public realm, defining how the buildings are fronting on those streets. A lot of codes use a kind of combination of that. We've identified others in the past, like using street types, but ultimately, I think those are the key ones that we've used, and perhaps in the future, there will be others. But defining that structure that you intend to use, I think can be really important when setting up a template code. Form-based codes can be applied to very specific geographic areas. I have written citywide form-based codes. I think it works really well when you've got older neighborhoods that have a very distinctive character and the community wants to maintain that character in the neighborhoods, especially if you've already got a mix of housing types in those neighborhoods. But they have been most successfully applied to sort of downtowns, TODs, main streets, greenfields, which I have done just as a structure for large lots or redevelopment lots, mostly in urban areas. I haven't done a lot of, new development, kind of new greenfields on the periphery of a community. The degree of predictability for a form-based code is defined by, how prescriptive it is. So that listing of objective regulations, the more prescriptive, obviously, the more predictable your buildings are going to be. The more flexible that you build your code, the lower the predictability is. So what we aim for is sort of something in the middle. We're not defining style. As I said before, we try to kind of meet those key aspects of building form. What's the building massing? How is the building relating to the street? How is the building relating to people? Human scale. I think we tend to kind of be in this realm somewhere. Other codes tend to be more flexible. Other form-based codes tend to be more flexible and can, have a lower level of predictability. So as I said, I think the SMART code is, and you've already heard a lot about this, but I just kind of want to give you a little bit of framing of the SMART code from my perspective. It's really an excellent framework. It's like a theoretical framework. It's something every planner should know. It was really built for American communities. I think the sort of idea behind the SMART code was to provide a framework for thinking about urban design in American communities. It has been used in other communities, but I think it's really important to note that it doesn't work everywhere. It works really well in, US and probably Canadian communities. As a template to work within your community, it is created to be more flexible. It has a whole series of sort of options to be used because it was built to be used in a really wide variety of communities. So it has building types, it has frontage types, it has regulations by T-zone or transect zone. It is, meant to be really, when you kind of dive in to look at it, just from the regulations for the T-zone and also looking at some of the building types, it creates a building envelope for per T-zone. So some of that building typology that you might get in that same zone, it doesn't regulate specifically, which is probably fine in most communities and what you need. But that sort of level of flexibility means that the level of predictability can be lower in some instances. The other piece of it is that the smart code as a tool or as a template within a community provides you all those options. You can do building types and frontage types, as well as just regulations for the zones. And what that has resulted in many form-based codes across the community is people have used this framework and created codes that I believe are too complex. In other words, you have to find, when you go to develop your lot, you need to use, and I'm not talking about people that have calibrated the smart code, I'm talking about people that have used the smart code as a framework. You have to look at regulations for the context area zone, the zoning district. Then you have building types, then you have frontage types. So there's all these layers of regulations, as opposed to just looking at one set of regulations for your parcel. So that degree of complexity and flexibility, I think, has made it really difficult to calibrate in some communities, but also to use as a framework. You just need to be aware of all that. There have been instances where communities have used the smart code to calibrate for their community, and you really need a professional who understands the smart code to calibrate it. It's a lot of information for one planner in one community to take and develop a code. And that's probably true for all templates, honestly. That calibration absolutely has to occur at the local context. What I have done a few times now in the country is created templates for specific regions. I did one for the Grand Rapids region a long time ago, like early form-based code days. That was really great fun, and I think really helpful for that community. I don't even think it's available anymore. I don't think you can find it. I certainly have it, but it's very much the same sort of process. I want to show you a little bit about this Salt Lake region code that we did, template code that we did, very specifically made for TODs, which is not, sort of your task, but I think it some of the generalizations can apply. So we created this for a really wide variety of areas throughout the Salt Lake region. Salt Lake City, the smaller communities around Salt Lake, to the kind of more suburban communities that were popping up, even some greenfield sites that were popping up, new traditional neighborhoods that were being developed within the Salt Lake region. The first thing that we did is we identified a series of place types to create a structure to hang the code from. The template was written with a whole lot of annotation, kind of like the smart code. We had this sort of a page of annotation per page of template code. But we also created an introductory document that was really kind of, here's how to plan for using this template code. And all of the slides that I'm showing you are from that introduction. So what we did was we identified place types, and that means we identified sort of TOD types, and where those TODs sort of fell into the community. They fell into the metropolitan center of Salt Lake, all the way to the sort of smaller main streets and the surrounding villages. So we identified those place types, and then we use those place types to define a series of districts and how many of those districts would occur within that place type, or, districts or zones, street types and where they would occur within those place types, open space types, all of the kind of components of those place types. And then within the districts, defined building types and uses within them. So this sort of structure was laid in place to help us apply the template code. The idea is that as a community, you go in and follow this process that we laid out to select what place type you're writing your code for, use our framework, calibrate all of the elements that are going into the code using the diagrams and the tables that we created for you. So much like the smart code, you can go in and just alter the numbers within the tables and then use the illustrations to your benefit, the same sort of thing in this code. However, we defined the building types based on the Salt Lake region. We defined the street types based on the Salt Lake region, which, by the way, are really wide out there in the West. So it was, really, it was calibrated to the region to begin with, so that the communities could work within it, already calibrated to some degree, and then they just had to take it to their local level and their place type level. As opposed to a kind of broad template that's created, for the nation as a whole, that you've got to calibrate for your region and then calibrate for your place. So you can kind of see, we created these place types. We did diagrams to show, illustrate how all of the zones or districts worked within the place type, what percentages you had, how much green space you needed, where it could be. And then we provided this sort of kit of parts. So I think that those levels of calibration that are needed already are really an important thing to consider for a model code for your state. So just to end, looking at that degree of predictability, how prescriptive you want to be with a model code, I think is really important versus how flexible, and, what are you going to lose in that sort of translation? And then thinking about that degree of calibration that's needed, whether or not it's written for the nation or written for your region, and how much calibration are you expecting, the communities to do, and how far do you want to take them? Because you cannot, we can't write a code for every community. It's if you didn't get this from what I've been saying, is you've got to dive into that community and understand the neighborhoods and what's on the ground to write a code for that community. The sort of broad brush is what got us here in the first place. We really want to make sure that it's calibrated at that local level. That's all I've got. Sorry, didn't mean to talk this long.
Oh, thank you so much, Leslie. I think that was really informative. I have, well, just picking up on your last part of your presentation about recalibration. Apologies, let me just, hopefully that'll go away in a second. Thank you, spam filter. What if you need to recalibrate, sort of the where we are is because of these sort of broad base, and I think I don't want to talk for Francis, but some of the problem with our streets, or maybe the way you were talking about the Salt Lake region, these super wide streets, they come about because of state road mandates that are adopted, but you really need to recalibrate that, not calibrate to it, but change the thinking. How does that come about in this kind of an approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you need to dive into the community, understand the existing context, and then what's desired by the community. That vision that's stated, you've got to look at that vision. What do we want to do? And then define those street types. Again, I think this is part of that sort of local context. If you've got really wide streets that you need to be narrowing up, There's the potential for moving those build to zones in and getting more developable area, or there's the potential for creating some really, luscious pedestrian realms, or accommodating bikes, in an area. So all of those little details, I think what we did for the Salt Lake template is we showed how you could sort of skinny up some of those streets and take in some of that land for other uses. If that's sort of something that's occurring in multiple communities, folding that guidance in, if you know that guidance, get it down on paper once. If I could just say 80% of what I do is taking the same things that every plan commission across the country says to every development and put it down on paper so that they don't have to say it again. I think this is what we keep doing. We keep having these same conversations over and over again about what to do with a really wide street. And, your community, that's the same conversation that every other community is making. If we could just get it down on paper and say, here's a way to address it. You need to look at it locally, absolutely, but let's get it down on paper so that we can talk more quickly from that starting point.
Leslie, I don't know if you could maybe stop sharing your screen so we can get all other folks up here. Usually this is not a shy group, and Steve has his hand raised. So Steve, please, what would you like to know?
Thanks, and that was a good presentation. Quick question, and I apologize if I missed it. And I know form-based code typically doesn't regulate density, but how have you handled that in communities where that's like a hot button issue, whether it's realized or not?
Yeah, I mean, density is, we're not going for density. We're going for housing for people. We're going for vibrant places. The term density has gotten used in ways, I know that analytically it's what we ultimately want, but we want better places that house more people and can accommodate more people without expanding, the community. And I feel like density has become sort of that short term to substitute in there. What we do typically is figure out how much height and how much building coverage and a mix of housing types that we can fold into the code to get you to that higher level of intensity. We may calculate that behind the scenes, but dwelling units per acre as a regulation in a code is not, it's the same thing as FAR. You have no idea what that physical form is going to be. And so what we want to do is kind of balance those two things out. Let's figure out how we can get height comfortably into a community that may be lower. What are the design elements that we can fold in that will make them more comfortable with it? How can we get in, sort of hidden density with things like ADUs and, multiple units within a big house that fits into, a neighborhood? How can we sort of fit it in within the character of, the architectural character, the building form of the community? I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Leslie, please.
Great job, Leslie. It's rare that I'm in a meeting with another Leslie.
Yeah, no kidding.
Really well done.
Thank you.
A couple of things on density. There are, for instance, the Smart Code actually does have recommended densities or potential densities to design to, and I know others do as well. And I think that we need to, that term calibration to the local is just critical. One of the daunting things about our task here is that we're trying to develop a model code for an entire state, a small state, but still an entire state. And that issue of density is one that actually has so many layers to it, because really when people talk about density, it's less that they're talking about how many people actually live on an acre. then they're talking about what is that parking going to look like, and how is this going to obstruct my neighborhood? Who is moving in, and a lot of both racial and class issues get morphed into that term of density. And so we need to be really clear when somebody uses words like that, what they're really talking about. Are they really talking about density and how close people are living to each other, and quality of life issues that may be associated with that? Or are they talking about behavior? Are they talking about traffic, which can also be another buzzword? So I think as we're doing our work, we need to be really cognizant of what is actually being talked about, what is actually being complained about. The other thing is, I just want to go back to the issue of the street width question. Connecticut, I have found, is the only answer to this is to continue to make sure that DOT gets educated, and that our public works folks and police get educated. Because one thing that people don't really get in general is that wider streets are not safer, straighter streets are not safer. And just explaining the difference between design speed and posted speed can sometimes help bring about a better understanding of how streets can or should be designed. I'll stop there.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Leslie. Greg?
Yeah. Oh,
I'm sorry, Leslie, you want to respond to that?
do you mind? I think it's also really important to note that what are the things that you're talking about that are planning, comprehensive planning or POCD, whatever you call it. What are planning things? And in my mind, defining what a lot of what you just were talking about is planning, and to keep in mind that a form-based code is a tool to implement the planning. And part of what's valuable, and part of the reason that the SMART code, for example, has densities in it, is because it is also a great planning tool. In fact, any community should be looking at the sectors and the transect to set up their comprehensive plans or their POCDs. It's definitely a tool to help with that planning. But then the code needs to be very clear how to implement those plans. So if that density is set for an area, this is our goal, then the code needs to show you how to get there, as opposed to what the goal is. And the same thing for streets.
Thank you. Greg?
Yes, so David, we're on quite a hot streak here with Leslie presenters giving great presentations. I'm just wondering who you have on deck next, which Leslie will be up.
Greg's are next, so.
Yeah, Greg's next, okay. But my question is, we've talked a bit about too how so many codes that are in existence, and we're seeing some of the results nicely done in the comparisons. We've used terms like hybrid, and as we educate and try to move forward, how do you see that bridge? How can we look and even help? We think that that's going to be one of the sticking points, is that it may not be a grab all, moving our code more toward a form-based.
The hybrid term is a really interesting situation. I think that typically I really avoid the term as much as possible. Some people use hybrid to say, oh, we're looking at uses and building form. Well, a form-based code looks at uses. So you really don't need to call it hybrid just because you're also folding uses into your zoning code. Some people use hybrid to say we have some conventional zones in our community and some form-based zones in our community. I think that's probably the best way to use it, to say, all of our large lot single family or all of our industrial is just going to be conventional code. I think there's some value to look at it from the perspective of the form-based code. And I just think it could just be a zone in a form-based code that just has less regulation. It's more flexible. I don't think you need to get into the sort of hybrid approach. I think sometimes the term hybrid is just a way to make people feel more comfortable that you're stepping into something new. And that's fine too.
That's helpful. That's your points are helpful.
Great.
Before we go to Ben, I just, Leslie, I don't know if you could drop into the chat the site that you were referencing before, say, you could see good images. And I think you said FDIC, but I think I got that wrong. And then that's like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation or something like that. So,
yeah. Okay.
So if you could do that, and then I'll let Ben, why don't you take over here?
Thanks, Dave. And thanks a lot for the presentation. I think that was very helpful. I'm sort of the amateur in the room. I'm an elected official and not a planner or anybody with a special expertise, but I actually have to pass some of this stuff. So I really appreciate getting sort of as educated on this as possible. I guess one question, again, it sort of goes back to the other Leslie's point, which is that our charge, is, to the extent it's defined at all, is really to help our municipalities, which, obviously still keeping control at this point over their zoning. How do we have value added at the state level? And certainly to the extent that what you're talking about is incredibly sort of labor intensive, and to do it right is very much a local, a lot of work there. Is there tools that we can ask the state to provide, or resources that would help local planners come up with the form-based codes in their own communities? And I think that's sort of a broader issue for our entire group, but again, how do we create that? It's not going to be off the shelf, but something that we come up with that again makes it easier for towns that do want to adopt it, if we're not coming up with some mandate, which it seems to me is unlikely.
So you think a model code for the state, a template code for the state is unlikely? Is that what you're saying?
At least one that mandates it. I think that now, certainly it helps to have that, your discussion of they take away the perception that there isn't use restrictions as well in a code-based form, and that's kind of helpful to put out. I think that is the perception, that that there would be no use restriction at all. But I'm hopeful, but I'm guessing that seems like a pretty big expansive goal to have actually a statewide code. And again, maybe other people are more optimistic than me, but at least one step would be to help, again, is helping municipalities get there. And is there anything that statewide we could do to make that easier, and less expensive, and rather than hiring somebody like you at a statewide level and saying it's not, and getting more people on staff who can help with that sort of thing would be one possibility. But again, what else can we do to help towns? And again, it's Connecticut, we have tiny towns that don't have the
Right.
the resources necessary to put into this, or at least don't think they do.
Yeah, I think, there's a certain amount of work that needs to be done. And I don't know how you get work done without doing the work. I do think that the similarities of the communities, just sort of diving in and looking at, the different places, lends itself really well to some kind of a template code. Whether or not it is focusing on the kind of low-hanging fruit, the places where we know this could have a huge impact, as opposed to doing a big giant, model code for everywhere. I think that's what could be done, is, just really sort of identifying, how do you get, I don't know if this is what your state needs, but I know that ADUs in most communities that I work in is a super great, not really a quick fix, but an easy fix that people have become more confident in, that can add, a lot of not just density, but, ways to make housing more affordable for people, ways to allow for aging in place, ways for, it just has so many benefits. So that's kind of a low hanging fruit, in my opinion. I think there's some other things that can be done too. How do you create, I know that for Missing Middle, there have been some examples where people have created multi-unit housing that can fit into a neighborhood. They've created, a sort of plug in, here's a design that you can use. That can be really helpful. There are a lot of little tools like that can be helpful. It just depends on what the goal is. I think establishing the series of goals and then picking some of the easy ones, and creating, tools to help with those might be the best bet. But, to redo your zoning code with just one staff person, means that it's best to use a template, in my opinion.
So before the other Leslie, I get to your question, I wanted to maybe suggest a couple of things. Ben, I still don't think, this is such a charged issue in the state of Connecticut that I don't believe it's our direction to develop a state zoning code. I won't say that because I don't believe it. And I think we would get shut down in a second by a lot of very angry people if we even suggested that. And I still think the idea is that we're developing something that can be applied. The ideal is to be able to develop a series of tools that could be used by communities to facilitate development of smarter growth and one of the underlying goals here is more affordable options broadly within 169 municipalities. One thing that occurred to me that we probably have already done to some extent, but that I think starts to address how do you apply some kind of a template, is you need to start developing some kind of a community matrix classification document that develops kind of a common a taxonomy to describe things. So a community could have elements of these 6 things or 10 things or whatever, and then perhaps you start to have these tools based other tools that can then, well, if you have this kind, then you should be looking at this type of a form-based code element. So it's just very, very broad thinking. I don't know, Leslie, how you think about that, but
me.
Yes, you.
Leslie.
And then the other Leslie.
I will say what that brings to mind is I was the first urban designer hired by the city of Austin. I worked with the neighborhood planners, Austin, Texas, and they had this sort of top down that every neighborhood needed to figure out a way in their neighborhood plan to introduce more density. When it was a bad word, it still is. But what we did do was we identified some locations that occurred in many neighborhoods, and that was on the back side of the commercial street across the alley, on that edge. Those locations tended to be rental single family housing. And the community was comfortable with that edge intensifying a little bit. And so what we did was we created a series of drawings that showed how a typical block could be intensified in a neighborhood. And that little diagram then was used by developers to go in and purchase or to redevelop the land that they already had into, something that still matched with the community's, building form, but created some intensity. It was a very specific, kind of little tool that was created for that situation. But we identified the situation first, and the commonalities, so that we could create that tool. So I don't know if that's helpful information.
Thank you. Leslie Crean.
Oh,
Mute.
you're muted.
Most used words during COVID. The Connecticut just recently passed, and probably most of, if not all, the planners who are on this Zoom know about this, but Connecticut passed and made effective October 1st of last year, Public Act 2129, which allows, unless a commission opts out of it, you can build an ADU on wherever a single family house is allowed, you can build an ADU as of right as well. So that single piece of legislation, not just the ADUs, there are a lot of things in there, actually covers a lot of issues that I think will help us with the work that we're doing. The other comment in terms of organization is one of the ways we might want to look at this is to think about whether it's form-based plan or form-based code or hybrid code or whatever it is, as the sort of physical piece of it, and then look at the possibility of modules that can be, a module for how to do gas stations, or a module for how to do, generally drive-throughs or things like that, so that it can become a thing that when municipalities need help trying to figure out how to design a drugstore or a fast food restaurant, they can go to that and say, well, how did they do it here? And how did they do it here? And what are the recommendations here? And those things exist. We, again, don't need to, we may need to massage the wheel, but we don't need to reinvent it.
Oh, David, you're muted.
Trying to control my phone, my landline, as my staff make fun of me. I don't know if there's any other questions for Leslie Olberholzer at this point. It doesn't look like anybody has their hand raised. We only have a few more minutes, and we have a couple things I wanted to go through. So that being said, Leslie, you're welcome to stay with us or not. But I wanted to again thank you so much for your presentation today. Oh, we got Caitlin Palmer that wants to speak. So give me a second, then we'll take Caitlin's question and answer. And again, thank you. But Leslie, go ahead, Caitlin.
Sure. We kind of, I think, have touched on this a little bit. And I guess I keep thinking like it's a very big task at hand. Has anyone, and forgive me if you touched on this, has anyone sort of taken like just a piece of it and maybe focused on tackling, like you said, sort of a specific issue, like the idea of missing middle housing? It's a hot topic in Connecticut. Housing is a problem in Connecticut. We have like the lowest construction rate in the United States, just about, where we're in like the bottom 3% or something. Taking like a more narrow concept, like developing sort of model code guidelines, and you could do it sort of like in context chunks, like, rural, suburban, urban, but maybe just focus on like one challenge. Kind of, I think what maybe Leslie, you were just saying, like, gas stations are like another way to approach it. And alternatively, I guess, or framework for, TOD/town centers as a area of focus that's a little just more narrowly defined than everything everywhere.
Oh, I hear the little kid coughing in the background. Caitlin had no kids when I
Okay.
first knew her. I will say just two quick things. One is I think you can, that's exactly what the TOD template was. It was meant to kind of solve this issue of TOD development in these specific locations. It wasn't a terribly huge project. It was fun and intensive just because we dove in and got to know every community that we could. And I think that background is really important. Little things like, we know how to do better gas stations. We know how to do better drive-throughs if you've got to have a better drive-through. You've got to have a drive-through. But so I think that those are all super doable. I will direct you to, and I'm not sure if it's still online. I'd have to look and see, but I did work on EPA's Smart Growth Office did a quick fixes for urban development in terms of smart growth, and they did a quick fixes for rural developments in terms of smart growth. And we had some excellent conversations with, great thinkers, zoning thinkers it was zoning quick fixes. So there's a ton that smart growth office. I think they got disbanded. And maybe they're back together, but they've got some great tools that were created there as well. Smart Growth America is also creating tools. So there's a lot of that kind of information already being done out there. Just a matter of kind of finding it, identifying it. But you can certainly, that's what I was kind of saying, is set your goals and what are those lists of things that can get you, what is that low hanging fruit that can get you further the fastest, and focus on those. So thank you.
Great, thank you
Very much.
Thank you.
Such a great project and such a great group.
Okay, a little bit of business about subgroup leadership. Thanks to Francis Pickering for volunteering to lead the group focusing on streets, and to Pete Harrison for the subgroup on implementation. And I guess I didn't get a volunteer for the code-based group. So unless somebody steps up, I guess that's going to default to me to lead that subgroup. I would say, and I'll put an email out to everybody, that it'd be good before our next meeting, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the 8th after the 4th, that those groups at least meet together or connect somehow via group chat, or however you all want to do that, emails, and what I think I'll do is I'll suggest to Pete and Francis that I could also facilitate a Teams meeting on my end to get everybody together. So, and then we'll be asking folks to report out to a degree to sort of get your initial thoughts on those subgroups. I don't have anything else for the group today. Does anybody else have anything that they'd like to share at this point? Steve?
I was just thinking that kind of the tail end of the conversation about how we frame things in terms of breaking it out into the different, whether it's the gas stations or do we look at the rural areas. I think that's kind of a big, I think that'll help focus the conversation quite a bit and kind of put us on a path to an end product.
Are you part of that group, the one and two?
I may be.
Okay. I'd have to bring up the trying to think. Oh, here it is. Where was it? The different groups, subgroups. So, oh, you are actually on the S&B. But anyhow, I will be getting meetings out, a follow-up email, probably hopefully by Monday, to get everybody thinking about this next step as we start to we really need to, we've gone through a lot of information gathering now, and I think we need to sort of shift into sort of strategizing and developing some kind of plan so we can report back to the larger group with our findings and our recommendations and so on. So I think that's where we need to head next within our working group. So any other final thoughts before we convene? Did I use the wrong term? No, end. I think we've been convening. Okay, then in that case, I look forward to speaking with everybody at the latest on the 8th, if not sooner. Thanks very much, and have a great 4th of July, everybody.
You too. Thanks.